Be advised that this commentary contains several spoilers from both Assassin's Creed 3 and Assassin's Creed Black Flag. Do not watch this unless you are fully up to date with the entire series. Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag created quite the conflict among fans of the series with both its chosen manner of presentation and the plot that encircled it. This aforementioned divide has arisen due to those who felt that it was the redeemer of the series, and those who felt that it abandoned the core of what makes Assassin's Creed. To an extent, I believe that the latter is correct, but that the former has the right idea. In this video, I'll expand upon a topic that will have some of you shaking your heads, and others will be screaming for mine. Why? Because I feel that Assassin's Creed 4 was not only a great game, but was also the best one in the series so far. Now before you all assemble the lynch mob, I'd ask you to hold your pitchforks and torches for just a minute and let me make my case. My contention with this video is that Black Flag offered the most powerful story yet to come out of the Assassin's Creed universe, and it did so, oddly enough, by deviating from the very elements that made people love the series. Part 1. The Deviation. Assassin's Creed 4 drew both heat and praise because it dared to be different, at least to an extent. The 5 previous installments all centered on the idea of assassins versus Templars, and how each faction had managed to install themselves into the various institutions that have existed throughout history, be it the Borgia in Rome, the Ottoman Turks, or the fractured elements of society from the American War of Independence. Black Flag, however, chose instead not to focus on the Templar-assassin conflict, but to instead focus on the people it influences, namely one in particular. Enter Edward Kenway, a farmer's hand turned pirate who seeks to make his fortune during the golden age of piracy in the West Indies. And it's from this character that our story gets its intense deviation. Previous characters, such as Altair or Ezio, followed some form of the conventional hero's journey. They were born into a family of assassins, suffer a fall that shakes the foundation of their lives at an early age, and strive to embody the Assassin's Creed while fighting to protect all that they hold dear from the vision of the Templar Order. As such, the previous installments fell into what could be described as a rough model of the hero's journey, traveled by a virtuous character, or at least one who has their priorities and intentions in order. Edward isn't like this at all, though. He has no existing ties to the Assassins or Templars, and to put it bluntly, he's not conventional protagonist material. Quite frankly, he's an asshole. His desires for a taste of the good life, as he puts it, drive him deeper and deeper into circumstances beyond his control as he steadily refuses to see that the world and people around him are changing. Because of this, combined with the harsh nature of the 18th century West Indies, and the trade of being a pirate, he desperately clings tighter and tighter to his delusions even as all he holds dear collapses around him. While this is indeed a fall of sorts, it occurs steadily through the natural circumstances of the game's setting, as well as Edward's own selfish nature, and is not some abrupt loss that inspires a story of revenge for the pursuit of justice. As such, the experiences in this game are not those of the role one plays in a war between the Assassins and Templars, but are rather those of an outsider's perspective. In the story, Edward sees 2 warring factions desperate for an advantage over the other, which he readily exploits, rather than choosing a side. You'll recall, for instance, in Sequence 5, Edward raids a fort that has the Templar Grandmaster Torres himself within, and has him at his mercy, but rather than handing him to the assassins, which he's met by this point, he sees an opportunity for material gain, and places it above any consideration for how it may impact those around him. Now, I think I know what you're asking. So the character's a prick. How does that make the game better? It works in this instance because we have the opportunity to witness a character go through the process of understanding and transformation in a way that Altair, Ezio, and Connor never had. Altair was arrogant at the start of Assassin's Creed 1, but he was still an assassin who had a clear sense of purpose. He already knew of certainty and of direction, but simply needed better instruction in the practices of the Assassin's Creed. Ezio embraces the creed almost immediately from the start of Assassin's Creed 2, when his Uncle Mario instructs him following the death of his family in Florence. Connor had Achilles to mentor him after leaving his village, and while he could certainly stand to learn something of patience, his heart was still in the right place and his purpose was clear. You see my point, I hope. All of these characters had a clear sense of purpose because of their place among the Assassin Order, and Edward lacks this same sense of direction because he has almost nothing to guide him except his own material desires. Consequentially, he forges his own selfish path in a grim environment that both rewards piracy, but also punishes those who take part in it. And this isn't just exclusive to Edward by any means. Effectively, the very nature of the West Indies and its inhabitants was what allowed for such a unique approach to be taken in an Assassin's Creed game, which is also the focus of Part 2. Part 2. Plot deviation from the Assassins and Templars. Aside from Edward, almost every character in Assassin's Creed 4 broke from the previous formula that had structured the series to that point. In the previous installments, you had the protagonists and his close companions, who had their own shortcomings, but ultimately embodied some sense of what we characterize as virtue, and were on the whole ethically sound. Then you'd have the Templars, who for all their talk of order and peace, were willing to resort to outright cruel and barbaric methods to achieve their goals, occupying the mentality that the ends justify the means. However, in the case of Assassin's Creed 4, the distinctions between hero and villain, good or bad, noble or insidious, if you will, are blurred considerably. Indeed, I would submit to you that there are very few actual heroes or villains in this game. As such, when we look at the story of Assassin's Creed 4, we have a hard time distinguishing between the ethics of the various characters, thus making it harder to categorize them into those we like and those we want to see die. In part, I believe that this is simply because of the game's setting, and the roles available to the developers when they were building their characters for this installment in the franchise. The 18th century West Indies were a cruel and unforgiving place to live, and their distance from the central empires of the Western world made law and order difficult to enforce, resulting in a lack of social stability, which in turn gave rise to the mentality of every man for himself, and thus the golden age of piracy. As such, when we look at Edward and his companions, be it Thatch, Hornigold, Rackham, whoever, we want to cast them in the role of, to put it bluntly, the good guys, because we spend so much time with them, and our protagonist is friendly with them. As such, we see their human side, which incidentally is something too many stories deny us when we look at antagonists in general. But because we see these traits in Edward's companions, we see them as actual people, and we view them in a more generous light. Consequently, we forget that they are pirates, thieves, plunderers, and even murderers. Though they may mask their intentions beneath the veil of defending man's natural freedoms or crude methods in the service of a noble cause, they are ultimately criminals. In that respect, you could argue their actions are following the same line of reasoning as the Templars, acknowledging acts of cruelty for what they are, but shielding their conscience behind the ultimate vision of their efforts. Now, that's not to say that there are no good people in this story. The Assassin Order, in their traditional role, are still in the Caribbean, and they do play an active part in the plot, just as the Templars do. When I say that the game deviates from their conflict, I don't mean that it's an outright abandonment of their parts in the story or of their roles in the central theme of Assassin's Creed, or that they don't matter at all. I merely contend that the goal of this game was to give a different perspective that could not be gleaned through the eyes of an assassin or a Templar. It's important to distinguish here that the assassins themselves are not the protagonists of this story, and indeed, the Order on the island of Tulum embodies the virtues we'd expect from a noble group of heroes fighting for justice in an unstable world. But if their order is not the focus of the story, then why call this an Assassin's Creed game at all? If the plot of Assassins vs. Templars is the backstory, then why bother adding it to the franchise? Why give it the title? And I'll tell you why. Because this game isn't about Assassins vs. Templars. But despite this, I believe that the game is more deserving of the title than any other in the franchise so far. Because this game is not about two feuding factions, two conflicting goals, or even two warring ideologies. This game is about the Assassin's Creed itself. You wouldn't notice it at face value because the assassins are only in select sequences of the story, and Edward is quite reluctant to embrace their cause until the final few memory segments, which I'll cover later. But what is the recurring goal in this story? It's a journey to find purpose in a world where social stability and ethical consistency are virtually non-existent. It deviates from the previous pattern present across the Assassin's Creed games, where the creed was present in the minds of the protagonists almost from the start, and instead, it forces the protagonist to discover it through years of self-serving actions and devastating losses, and these ultimately culminate in his discovering the creed through what I feel is the best exposure to it yet done in any of the franchise's installments. Part 3. Now this is my point, the result, the mise en scène of this entire video, if you will. So this game did everything different and offered a new approach to exploring the concepts that constitute the Assassin's Creed universe. But what makes it better than the previous installments? Because Edward was not plunged into the conventional hero's arc and was instead surrounded by those who embodied similar traits to himself, namely having a broken moral compass, his journey was one of realizing the Assassin's Creed over time through a powerful transformation, which I mentioned earlier. This transformation was able to employ plot elements that wouldn't have been nearly as effective in the traditional hero's story. To demonstrate this, I'll center in on 3 characters and their subsequent deaths. The first character to view is Thatch, or Blackbeard if you prefer. Thatch is arguably the older brother or mentor to Edward in the earliest stages of the game. Edward regularly consults with him on the state of affairs in Nassau and feels genuine concern for his well-being, particularly after the medicines and the Siege of Charlestown segments. Through the connection between these 2 characters, we detect a sense of compassion and affection amidst their criminal backgrounds. Now, Thatch has no connection to the Assassins or Templars, and instead serves as Edward's foundation in the pirate elements of his career. But he also serves to remind us of the nature of piracy, and why the main characters act as they do. Though they seek fortune for selfish desires, some of them do so out of a sense of longing for purpose or certainty in a cruel environment. During Thatch's death scene, we see Edward's first signs of transformation. Before Blackbeard is decapitated, he shouts out one of the most important lines in the game. "In a world without gold, we might have been heroes." Now, believe me, I am not one for extracting meanings from things that aren't there, and I hate the idea that everything has to hold a secret message from the storyteller, or that each action is allegorical with the intention of conveying a secret meaning in the service of a higher purpose. But in this instance, Blackbeard's death is really the first time we see any sort of change in Edward, however subtle it may be. That's not to say that his pirate nature dies with Blackbeard by any means, but rather that with Nassau's fall and Blackbeard's demise, Edward has lost his sense of purpose among the pirate elements of his life. And it's at this point that he and the other pirates strike out to find a sense of self, inevitably leading to conflict between them as their paths diverge. Which leads me to my next character example, Hornigold. Following the fall of Nassau, Hornigold, in search of a new path of his own, signs on with the Templars and works under Governor Rogers as a pirate hunter, and he begins tracking down those with whom he had previously worked, including Edward Kenway. Now, he's not the only one to follow this course by any means, but I use him as a sample among many for one purpose. As Hornigold dies following his pursuit of Edward, he asks Edward Kenway a critical question. He asks him what he's done with his life since Nassau fell, and how Edward remains a lowlife seeking personal gain and destroying those who were searching for lives of their own. Incidentally, this also occurs when Edward kills Burgess and Cockram, whose dying words also weigh heavily upon Edward's mind. They claim to have found a new life that he has now destroyed, claiming that among the Templars they found purpose, and that the Templars were their family. As such, Hornigold and the others are a good example of the center phase of Edward's transformation, where he begins to doubt his course, but still remains driven by personal gain, if not slightly less changed by his encounters with his old friends. Now, this stubborn refusal to alter or find purpose is finally crushed by the third example, which I'll focus on, Mary Read. In my opinion, after Edward, Mary Read is the most important character in this game. Though she is a pirate, she operates within the Assassin Order, and her presence serves as a reminder of the Order's presence in the Caribbean, and of the deeper conflict being waged beneath the surface war of pirates plundering naval vessels. It's Mary Read who first introduces Edward to the Assassins, and who regularly pushes him to find deeper purpose in his life, to work with the Assassins and hopefully join them outright. And though she expresses frustration at Edward's unwillingness to commit to a higher cause, she does maintain a close friendship with him, both out of compassion for him, and out of her confidence that through the Assassin's Creed, any person, no matter how astray, can be brought to make the world better. Now, Mary, along with Thatch, are probably the 2 characters whom Edward is closest to, and as such, they weigh the most heavily upon his conscience as he slowly moves away from his own selfish desires. The culmination of this can be seen in Sequence 11. Quick narrative. Edward is imprisoned following his botched attempt to acquire the observatory, and as such, he witnesses the trial of Mary Read and Anne Bonny, who claim pregnancy to avoid execution for piracy. Following this, Edward is placed in a gibbet and is soon rescued by Atabai, the leader of the assassins in the Caribbean. Now this point right here, to me, is the turning point of Edward, where his compassion for others finally trounces his selfish desires. He He willingly infiltrates the prison instead of running to freedom, and willingly risks life and limb to go to the aid of one for whom he cares deeply. Not exactly the actions of a selfish pirate. And then we have what I felt was the most important scene in the game, Mary Reed's death. Due to her having given birth to a child, combined with the unsanitary conditions of a Jamaican prison, Mary falls ill and is gravely weakened. She asks Edward to make right what he has wronged, and with her assurance that she will always be with him, she passes away, leaving Edward both devastated, but finally transformed. Okay, so people die, and it's sad. Why is it better? Why does this make the game better at all? The character has lots of people he's close to, and they die. Sounds just like the hero's loss to me. Not really, no. Edward lacks focus and conviction for most of the story, only formally working with the assassins in the final sequence to hunt down the remaining Templars. The real journey of this game, if you want to use the term journey, is not the fulfillment of a purpose, but is rather the discovery of one, something Connor, Ezio, and Altair all had from the start of their games, in Ezio's case 3. As such, their story suffered from falling into a predictable template. I'll use Connor's story for the sake of time. Now, Assassin's Creed 3 was a fun story to play through. It had a great setting, and the presentation was well executed. However, its story wasn't powerful, at least not in my opinion, because it suffered from predictability. From the start, we knew that Haytham was Connor's father. We knew that he was a Templar. And we knew that Connor was working against the Templars. He was working against Haytham and his followers. And he would inevitably be pushed to kill his own father because that's what his purpose in the exhausted story of Assassins vs. Templars while pursuing revenge dictated. Additionally, and I mean no disrespect here, I truly don't, but Connor's character was quite bland. We knew he suffered loss from a young age and found himself on a path of revenge that led him through the traditional conflict of the Assassins and Templars, also known as the hero's path. Thus, events like Connor finding his mother burning alive, being forced to fight alongside those who would inevitably take his land and culture from him despite his fighting so hard to protect it, being forced to slay his own father. All of these events, which should have been incredibly powerful scenes, they had the makings of powerful scenes, they should have been powerful scenes, but they lost so much of their impact because we knew they were coming. Connor's path dictated that he would strive to overcome his early losses and continue along the path shown by his mentor, resulting in his defeat of the antagonists and ultimate resolution of the plot. Again, it's the hero's path, overused and exhausted. Now, I enjoyed Assassin's Creed 3. I truly did. I truly enjoyed it. But I also felt slightly let down by some of its elements. It had the potential to really pull at the heartstrings with its events and its atmosphere. But again, its impact was dulled by the predictability of the hero's template. Now with Black Flag, on the other hand, we got something different. Edward had no hero's template to follow. Indeed, he would likely be classified as a villain if placed in the conventional story setting. The story of Black Flag is of one man's discovering the Assassin's Creed, and the certainty that it can provide in a cruel and shifting world. And the principal tools for conveying this story are the characters and their connection to each other. Why else would I commit so much time to their significance, after all? Thach's death shakes Edward's sense of self as he loses his mentor in his pirating career, and this starts his process of doubt. Thach's final words confer to Edward the message that a greater good perhaps could have been served had they not committed so much effort to material pursuits. Hornigold shows Edward the destructive nature of his path and the harm he does not only to himself, but also to others as they try to build lives of their own, and it weighs upon him. And of course, Mary's death is the final turner. Now, I place so much significance in this scene because it exemplifies that the story's focus is a search for purpose, but is conveyed heavily through character connection, rather than through conventional hero progression. This scene is Edward's critical shift because he has now lost his closest friend, whom he cared for deeply, and the power of this scene is reciprocal between both characters. Before she dies, Mary witnesses Edward's determination to get her out of the prison, and his refusal to leave her behind. Hence she knows that her actions have made a difference in his life. Her final words, "I'll be with you, Kenway. I will." And these don't serve as the typical tragic final words that one would speak to a lost love, but rather as the genuine consolation to both of them. Mary dies knowing that she has helped him to find a new purpose, and that his life will chart a better course for it. A scene like this would have been lost in the conventional hero story. Oh, good lord, here we go again. The protagonist has lost someone dear and close to them, died in their arms. Okay, now go mourn, kill the bad guy, and make everything right again. Blah, blah, blah. In the conventional hero story, that's exactly how this scene would have played out. But it doesn't in the case of Black Flag. This scene carries such a significant impact in the case of Black Flag because the story has progressed in such a manner that we came to care about Edward's transformation, and we knew that Mary was the chief catalyst to making it happen. As such, the player is even offered a bittersweet satisfaction of knowing that her efforts have finally gotten through to him, and that Edward and Mary parted as friends. Again, something we probably wouldn't have cared about in the traditional hero story. But even Edward expresses this concern to Anne Bonny at the beginning of Sequence 12, to which she responds, "She thought the world of you, Edward. Have no worries about that." In a conventional story, we probably wouldn't care about these details. But because the story was built by using the characters' ties to one another, we have a whole new emotional plane on which this story may be viewed, which plays right through to the final scene of the game. And the effect of this method is almost instantaneous. Following Mary's death, Edward finally moves to repair the damage that he's done, but he now does so with a sense of purpose that has been conveyed through the careful build-up of events, rather than through a single childhood loss. Now when he acts, it's not exclusively through the preset needs of the hero's path, but instead is with a true sense of purpose that holds infinitely more significance to the player than the conventional hero's journey could ever provide. That is why these scenes hold power that the previous games have not, because they have been presented in a manner that defies conventional narratives. The sense of loss is used effectively, and not just as an early game excuse to start a massive journey. When Edward finally acts for the Assassin's Creed, he does so with a true sense of purpose that has been conveyed over years of struggle and loss, and he is motivated not by revenge, as is often the case in these stories, but by a desire to do right by those who are gone. The very final scene of the game, where Edward remembers all those whom he has lost, really pulls at the heartstrings in a way that no other scene before this in the Assassin's Creed franchise has done. Now, stories often use this device, recalling the dead, but it doesn't really work unless you set it up correctly, and this game did just that. This scene shows us that Edward is still haunted by his friends' deaths, particularly Mary and Thatch, but there is also reassurance in that he knows that he has done right by them, and that he will move into a new future, honoring what his lost friends have taught him, and working for what all of them truly wanted in the first place, a sense of belonging and certainty in the cold nature of the 18th century, which he found, as Mary knew he would, along the path of the Assassin's Creed. Well, thank you all so much for watching this little commentary of mine. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed putting it together. If you'd like to offer any contrasting opinions or supporting opinions or any input of any kind, feel free to voice it below or make a video response, whatever floats your boat. Thank you to Ubisoft for creating such a great game. I hope to enjoy more of your works in the future. And thank you all for watching. Take care.